Welcome back to the Happy Saver podcast. I'm Ruth, a personal finance blogger right here in Aotearoa. And as you know, in this podcast, I chat with a really diverse bunch of people and I learn their story and then I just condense it down into an essay so that you can hear helpful, relatable stories from Kiwis who are sharing their experiences, their tips and their point of view on personal finance here in New Zealand. Now, when I received an email from a guy called John saying that he and his wife Betty have gone from being terrible with money and trying, unsuccessfully, to grow wealth via debt to completely changing their mentality to one of getting away from debt, even going so far as to head to the mines in Australia to clean up the consumer debt mess that they'd created, well, you can be pretty sure that they had my attention. Today, I want to share the story of this 38 and 39-year-old couple who are married with 2 primary school age kids and are on the crest of a knowledge wave when it comes to money. Month by month, they are reassessing everything they thought to be true about money and are now tackling their biggest remaining debt head-on, which is their $480,000 mortgage. Now, before I really get into it, you know how this goes, a quick message from today's fabulous sponsor. I'm a massive fan of creating multiple sources of income because I believe it makes you more financially resilient. However, you need to be sure that extra hours spent working on a side hustle translate into actual money in your pocket. PocketSmith helps manage secondary income from a side hustle by integrating various financial accounts, providing customizable budgeting and cash flow forecasts, and offering a detailed dashboard unique to each side hustle for transaction management and net worth tracking. If you want to supercharge your finances with PocketSmith, have we got a deal for you. Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of PocketSmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/the happy saver. That's pocketsmith.com/the happy saver. There was not too much lead into our kōrero. John had been a follower of my blog for a while and then emailed me out of the blue with a quick outline of his situation. I learned enough to know I wanted to know more about him and his wife Betty, and these are not their real names, by the way. And these days I let the people I kōrero with choose their own names, so John and Betty it is. Now, I go into every interview I do with a really open mind, often knowing only a really tiny amount about them before we begin. And I'll say to the people I speak with that the point of me putting so much mahi or work into this podcast is to show others listening what other Kiwis are doing with their money, and most importantly, what good bits they can pull from the episode to improve their own financial lot in life. We hear too much, I think, about what people do wrong with money and never enough about how they actually fix their problems. So, as John and I dug into things and he regaled me with his entry into consumer debt and their eventual exit out of it, he dropped a few clangers that had me nervous about the lessons people will take from this episode. And it had me asking him straight up if he has indeed put debt behind him. Let's just say, if I didn't think he had turned a corner, you wouldn't be listening to this episode. So John said he found my podcast and blog at the start of 2023 when he reached a point of being sick of not feeling like they had their personal finances sorted. He felt they could be doing their money differently, and his antennae was raised for some new financial knowledge. Betty and John were already 38 and 37 by then, with 2 small children aged 5 and 7. They had good jobs and a home of their own in a regional town that has a population of about 65,000. And even though this was apparently meant to be the Kiwi dream, something was off, and it was a chance kōrero with his neighbour that triggered him to go searching for information on how to manage their money. So what could this neighbour have said that was so profound? It was telling John to spend half of his money and save the other half. And it's often the most simple conversation that can kick a person into gear. So let's go back a bit and learn a bit more about what got them to this more recent point of feeling dissatisfied and desiring a change. John said he grew up with an older sister, and Betty is the youngest of 4. He said that growing up in his whānau, he didn't go without, but they were not rolling in money by any stretch. He remembers his parents as hard workers who strived to achieve. His mum worked for a telecommunications provider on the corporate side, and his dad worked at a port, out on the water, driving tugs and pilot boats. His parents have since divorced, and his dad is now retired, but his mum owns and runs a successful tourist venture. So, how did they teach him about money growing up? Well, his response was that they didn't really, or if they tried, he doesn't remember, maybe because he was simply just not interested. But the topic of money was not a common conversation at home, apart from some memory of hearing them talking about their mortgage debt or conversations about the advantages and disadvantages of them borrowing more money to buy cars. His dad, like John, is a petrol head, and it's in the blood, it seems. Now, there's a common theme throughout all of my podcasts of families not talking to their children about money. And the second theme is that the people who end up on this podcast realise that it's their responsibility to educate their own tamariki about money. So that's tip 1 from today. Teach your children good financial habits from a young age. Now, sadly, Betty's dad passed away when she was 12 years old, meaning that her teenage years were spent with her mum and siblings. John was speaking on behalf of Betty during our kōrero, and he said that, to his knowledge, Betty's mum never earned a lot and was both careful and cautious with her money, being careful to juggle so that none of them went without, but there were limits with what they could do. And it must have been incredibly difficult for her mother to navigate the financial side of life during this time. John finished school at the end of year 12 or 6th form, and by that time he had already got a loan to buy a car. So not a great financial start to life, if you ask me. Cars featured a whole lot during our conversation, and given I know quite a lot about cars, mechanics, and young men and women buying cars, well, I was pretty interested in the details. His first car was a Mini Cooper. He bought it off his elderly neighbour for a grand sum of $500, and not long after, he sold it to a family friend for $2,000, and fun fact, that friend still owns it today. Now, instant alarm bells rang for me here, as I knew that he would immediately start to equate buying and selling cars with making money, and I was not wrong. His second car was a Holden Barina GTI, the price of which he couldn't recall, and his third, a 1991 Honda Civic for $6,000. Now, coming up with the first $500 would have been pretty easy, I suspect. Odd jobs or a part-time job, plus living at home with no expenses, would get you that sort of cash pretty darn quickly. But the quality and price of the cars he bought also began to increase pretty quickly, and to pay for the first higher-priced car, he borrowed money from his parents. Now, they borrowed extra against their house, so that is, they increased their mortgage to give him money to buy the car, and he set up payments back to them, and he also paid interest. And as we chatted this through, though, he doesn't think he actually paid his parents back in full. Now, I've come across this situation more times than I can count now. A parent helps a child finance a vehicle, but the payments peter out at some point. Either the car needs repairs and the mechanic gets paid before the parent, or some other financial commitment comes up, or the car gets totaled or sold, or the parents could have gifted money in the first place, but were trying to teach their child some kind of lesson about handling debt, but they forget to keep track of the whole deal. It is very, very easy to lose track because John's third car led to his fourth, a Type R Integra for $12,500, and one that he actually imported from Japan, which is pretty ballsy for a guy in his late teens or early 20s, and he went on to sell it for the same amount that he paid for it, he said. And because I actually currently work in the auto repair industry, I know full well that he would have spent time and money on each of these cars. When someone says, I made money on that car, always dig a little deeper. Buying and selling for $12,500 will not be the true reflection of what this car cost him. Now, I live in a small town and have observed how teenagers buy cars today, and not much has changed. The parents either loan their kids the money or the kids work a part-time job to save up for them. Some of them then begin to trade in and out of different cars, and all of them end up spending money modifying, repairing, and obviously maintaining their cars. All of them are surprised how much more cars cost than the buy price. Buying the car is just the beginning. Now, I was chatting about the myth of making money from cars with a colleague, and he let me know that he actually did make some decent coin from buying a car for $350 and selling it 2 months later for $8,350. A lucky conversation led him to a car that had sat in an old guy's garage for many years, and he bought it so cheaply because he thought it needed a new engine. Well, it turns out it didn't, and it turns out that it was a sought-after model, hence the $8,000 profit. In music to my ears, he put the whole lot on his mortgage. He's since repeated this exercise, making about $5,000, which he also put on his mortgage. But he was really clear to point out, these are really rare finds. Now, if I ever get the chance to talk to someone who has purchased their first car, I always remind them to set up a bank account, call it car repairs, and automate a $20 to $30 a week transfer into that account. And that way, when they need a WAF for $80, a $300 service, a $110 rego, and some repairs, well, they'll have some money set aside to pay for it. Plus, they will need to budget for petrol on top of that. John left school at 17 years old to work as a labourer in an auto mechanics workshop, and then, when he was 18, to study for a 1-year diploma in information and communication technology. So, how did he pay for his education and just his life in general? Well, the memories were pretty hazy, but he said he lived at home, probably borrowed money off his parents, or they just paid for his $3,000-ish course fees. Plus, he also worked part-time at a supermarket. And cars featured heavily in his life during this time. Next, he said he had the amazing idea for him and 2 mates to spend a bit of time in Oz. They were all about 19. He'd saved up about $3,500, and they probably did the same because none of them planned to work while there. But they did certainly plan to have a good time. Too good, it seems, because at one point, due to a bit of misbehaving, they found themselves kicked out of their accommodation. But undeterred, they bought a tent and moved into a camping ground instead, all sharing one tent for a few months, all the while having a great time, living off beers, kebabs, and not much else before heading back home to Aotearoa. Now, when he returned, he actually began an apprenticeship as a mechanic, and he really settled into his job, staying in that career for 6 years. Now, it took him 3 years to become a fully qualified automotive technician, which, in hindsight, he could have completed quicker had he applied himself. But he said he had no ambition to get it done, and he slowed himself down, particularly on the paperwork side of the course. While it's true that you are paid to learn on the job, there is coursework that needs completed, and after a long, hard day at work, he lacked the motivation to get it done, he said. And he said that if he was being honest, back then his work ethic was average at best. So he started out earning $18.50 an hour, and when he left at the age of 27, he was earning $38 an hour. Mechanics like cars, no surprises there. So while he worked there, he also imported into New Zealand a few of his own to work on, a BMW and a Mazda. And at this stage of our conversation, I can see that money just seemed to turn up at the right time and that very little attention was actually paid. So what led to a change in career, taking him away from being an auto technician? He was giving a customer a ride back to her workplace in her company car, which was a new Honda Accord. And while making conversation, he asked, "How do I get a job with a fancy car like this?" Well, she said, "Come into my office for a job interview. I work in the insurance industry, and I'll tell you." So shortly thereafter, he went in for an interview, and he accepted a job. And just 3 to 4 weeks later, he had changed from working as an automotive mechanic to a career in the insurance industry, just like that. And I had to ask if he made a habit of asking career questions of complete strangers, because I know that I certainly do that. And he said that, nope, this was just a complete one-off. But he had been losing interest in his job. He couldn't see career growth as a mechanic. And he realised that he worked in mechanics because it was his passion to work on his own cars, not fix other people's. It was simply time for a change, and he happened to ask the right person the right question at the right time. His comment on lack of career progression was an interesting one. Automotive workshops are generally privately owned, and one day those owners need to retire. And I'd love to see more young technicians realise that they could buy an existing workshop of their own one day, but to do that, they have to have that as a financial goal very early in their career. And that way they can get their finances in order, plus work on their own skills to develop into business owners themselves. So there is career progression. You just have to go looking for it. Once John entered the insurance industry, it would take a year for him to get his own work car, a Ford Falcon, making do with his trusty old 1991 Commodore, which he said he would hide around the corner if he had to attend a client meeting. Now, I like how he had no qualms about giving up his Holden to drive a Ford either. He started in the insurance industry as a cadet for one of the major insurance brokers for 12 months, earning just $41,000 a year. He then progressed to account manager and his income rose to $57,000 a year, which was moving in the right direction. And during this time, when he was in his mid to late 20s, his mum actually set him and Betty up on a blind date. His mum knew Betty via the IT industry they were in and thought they would hit it off, and she was right, they absolutely did. Betty had done a degree at New Zealand Radio Training School, which she took out a student loan to pay for, had then worked for a small regional radio station, but after being made redundant, she moved into retail IT. They lived a few hours apart for a period before she moved to his town into his flat, and pretty soon they bought their own place. Now, I've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to dig more into the financial side of life during all those years. John said that absolutely, without a doubt, he lived paycheck to paycheck. Money came in on payday and it went right back out again. His only saving was via KiwiSaver, and deciding to do that might have come about because his father was in a work superannuation scheme and told John it was a good idea. He only signed up to put the minimum 3% in, and his employer did the same. But apart from that investment, all the rest of his money went on good times and cars, he said. As for Betty, she was more of the saver, the one that looked after her money, but I don't think that extended to investing. Instead, just saving up for things that she wanted to buy later. Now, if you are saving up for things and then you spend all that money on the thing without creating any long-term investments, then really it's also still just living pay to pay. But given I wasn't speaking with Betty herself, I couldn't learn too much more about that, When they got together, they didn't talk about money as such, just the basic elements of it. Simple questions like, can we afford to do something together? Did each of them have enough cash to spend? It was very much looking at expenses they had coming up and how they would cover them. Because they had moved in together, they did open up their first joint account, which they both deposited money in, so that they could make sure that they could pay the power, the rent, and pay for food and what have you. But outside of those core expenses, they both very much worked to make the money to go out and spend it to live life. They got engaged, and in 2011, they bought a house together. It cost them $268,000, and they took out a mortgage with a 25-year term. So how on earth did these two paycheck-to-paycheck spenders manage to get a house deposit together, I hear you ask? KiwiSaver. That was it. They both drained their KiwiSaver accounts, which gave them enough of a deposit and which satisfied the bank that they would be a safe bet to lend money to. As to how much the deposit was, he couldn't even recall. John said himself that given current house prices, it's much harder to wing it these days like these two did just 13 years ago. And personally, I think it's a missed opportunity that KiwiSaver has been hijacked for first home deposits. And the reason is because with the rising cost of houses, if you deplete your retirement savings, you have so much catching up to do during your working life, paying off both a hefty mortgage while trying to save for retirement. I've learned from people like John and Betty, and I'm teaching my daughter to do her best to prepare for both, save for retirement and save to buy a home. Because I've educated her to get started so early, she will be on a far stronger financial footing to be able to do both. I'll keep you posted on how that goes. But I think me saying that this is the trick. We know people are going to retire and we know they want to buy a house. And if we start early, they can plan for both. Again, this comes back to speaking with your family about what they might need money for in the future and how they might start to save and plan for it now. They didn't just take on a mortgage though, these two. They now had close to zero in their KiwiSaver and had also individually and collectively started to sink deeper into consumer debt. Even though John had a work car, this guy still loved cars and had his own, and he had a car loan of about $25,000 for a private car that he had. And given he had long since stopped borrowing money off his parents, this debt was with the ANZ Bank and something that they rolled into their mortgage. Now, the trouble with rolling debt into another debt is that you feel like you've paid it off, but you've not. You've literally just moved it about a bit. All the while, John was pouring money into fixing up his cars, which he was racing, which is an expensive hobby and a bottomless pit of spending if ever there was one. And nothing says, I love you, like a $4,500 engagement ring, which they also borrowed money for. Betty was still, of course, paying off her student loan with 12% deductions from each paycheck. Now, we didn't go into the details of it, but John said that they always used hire purchases, store cards or credit cards, to buy things like a TV, furniture, or a new phone. He said that they always paid it off in time, so were avoiding extra interest charges or late fees. And they saw that as a financial success, saying to themselves, wow, look at us go, doing so well at paying it off and not being charged interest and penalties. Instead of taking the opposite view, that with every new payment they had to make, they were foregoing yet another chunk of every future paycheck. Having been around financially sorted people personally for years now, I can tell you that it's safe to say that none of them carry consumer debt. John and Betty fully combined finances when they bought the house together, and now both could see that pretty much all of their take-home pay was already spoken for, paying off the mortgage, the student loan, the engagement ring, the car loan, and increasingly John saw that the debts they had couldn't be serviced by the money they earned. It was an uphill battle that was only getting harder. There was absolutely nothing stopping them from going deeper into debt at this point in their lives, yet they failed to see that the pressure coming down on them was of their own making. He was 3 years into his insurance job, they were in their late 20s, and he had another fateful conversation that would change both of their lives and pivot them off into a completely different direction. He got a phone call from his cousin who said, I've got a job for you back on the tools, working as a mechanic in a small mining town, 18 hours drive north of Perth for much better money. How much is much better money, considering that the last time he worked in this field he was earning $38 an hour? Well, they were paying $150 Australian an hour, plus superannuation, working 60-hour weeks. As part of his pay, he would also get a $750 a week living allowance to cover their housing costs, which were high. John said that he told his boss at work about the job offer, and they offered to help him pack. It was a no-brainer that they took this opportunity. Apart from the pay on offer, why did they decide to upend their lives and go there? He said in an email to me that they decided to go there to work hard, make money, and smash out the various consumer debts that he and Betty had accumulated, and once they had accomplished their mission, well, they would come home. They decided that he would head over there first and save up the $20,000 that they would need to pay for a wedding. And as soon as the party was over, they both went over there and they planned to stay for 2 years. My thought here was that their plan to smash out debt was immediately hijacked and put on hold while they paid for yet another expense. And I had my fingers crossed that they wouldn't see something else that they wanted to buy and would actually settle down and do what they said they would do, which was to clear up their debts. Now, if you want to know what heat feels like, move to Australia. He remembers it getting to 50 degrees one summer. That is why the money was so good. The conditions are brutal. Betty had secured an administration job at the hospital in the town they were moving to before leaving Aotearoa, working 4 days a week, earning, he thought, $50,000 to $60,000 a year. So although the housing allowance was $750 a week, which is good, they were paying $480 a week for one room in a 4-bedroom shared house, with each couple paying $480, so $1,920 a week for the whole house. But then the mining area they were in had a downturn, and just a few years later, the housing bubble burst, and there were too many houses to rent and not enough tenants, as they had left to find work elsewhere, meaning that John and Betty were able to actually rent a whole house for $500 a week. Now, all the while, they kept their house in New Zealand that they had rented out because they fully intended to move back into it, and the rent they received covered their mortgage payment. With big paychecks coming in, they managed to save money for the first time. And seeing the potential of the situation they found themselves in, he said that they began to change their mindset around money. They thought they could do better with the money they earned, but they were not quite sure how yet. Now, financial success has always been them feeling they were doing well to get a debt paid off in full before they got charged interest. But working in Australia and earning enough money to get out of the habit of having to borrow money to buy what they wanted, it was a real game changer. And John was really honest when he said that in hindsight, They actually did always earn enough back in New Zealand, but their sloppy money habits were so well ingrained that they couldn't even see that there was a problem to solve. Saving up to pay cash for something was just too hard. They could only save $20 a week because they were just so bad with money, with so much of every paycheck leaving their account each week to pay off previous purchases. Going to Australia, it woke him up to hard work and pushing himself to do better and earn better, and having a surplus of money left each week after they had paid their bills gave them a bit of a boost. But it takes some time for some people to really make a change, and they were not at their tipping point yet. So I asked if their thought was to go over, work hard, make money, pay off all their consumer debt, and then put that chapter behind them and get better with money. No, their thought was absolutely just go over, make money, and pay off all these debts. Making more money would solve their problems, they thought, which it kind of did. But when they got to zero money being owed, but the income kept coming in, there were no next steps. They had created a really good gap between what they earned and spent, but they had no idea what to do with that spare money. So mostly, they just spent it, pointing to a glaring hole in their and many Kiwis' financial literacy. What is the next step when you get out of consumer debt? If you want to get ahead financially, you need to create a gap between what you earn and what you spend, always striving to spend less than you earn. And with the gap, you invest this money into assets that will grow in value. This might be a rental property, KiwiSaver, or ETF or index share investments. But they didn't have this knowledge. They achieved their goals of paying off all their debts, plus via rental payments alone, they had reduced their mortgage by $50,000, but they spent the gap, the money that was left over, instead of taking the next step and using that to grow wealth. He considers this one of their financial flops, not making the most of that good income opportunity when they were young enough to have a lot less outgoings if they chose to, and not taking the opportunity to pay the mortgage off completely, which they really could have done. Instead, they spent the gap. While they were there, as was compulsory, they joined an Australian superannuation scheme, which at that time gave them 9% employer contributions to their funds on top of their incomes. He said that in regards to saving for retirement, the mentality in Australia is so very different to here. It's an added benefit where employees want their contributions to be high because they appreciate that this money invested early will grow to a lot in retirement. Here, he thinks that KiwiSaver is a box where you tick the minimum contribution of 3% or match whatever your employer will contribute, which is often just 3% or slightly more, and people are just not understanding the potential of this investment and how important a decent KiwiSaver balance will be in retirement to supplement superannuation income. He's pleased he learned the value of a superannuation fund early in life. When they returned to Aotearoa in 2018, after 3.5 years away, longer than the original 2-year plan, they had just $20,000 in cash, plus they had brought money home with them so that they could pay off Betty's student loan in full. They both rolled their Australian superannuation into their KiwiSaver accounts. John said that Betty resisted doing it because it was financial admin and easy to put in the too hard basket. But they got it done and her balance was $40,000 and his was $80,000, which was a huge shot in the arm for future them as they played catch up for the money that they took out to buy a house because of their inability to save for a deposit. Personally, unless you plan to regularly return to Australia to work or plan to retire there, I'm in favour of bringing your superannuation home to your KiwiSaver, and my reasoning is that it just keeps your financial administration simple. In my opinion, if you are a New Zealander, it's a good idea to locate your money where you are in the world, as it's easier than you think to forget what accounts you had where. So they returned home because they were expecting their first child, and they returned to their original home. They had done what they set out to do, and they paid off all their consumer debt, and when they got back, they also paid $15,000 cash for a Mazda to get the whānau from A to B. Now, you've no doubt heard all the sales pitches from property investors, right? You rent out your home if you go away. the rent covers the mortgage, and magically, it also seems to cover the property manager, the rates, the insurance, the maintenance, the accountant, etc., etc., etc. It's pretty much, from what I've heard, a fail-safe, air quotes, passive investment. Except I've also often heard firsthand that it's not. Betty and John fully intended to keep their home because they were only going to be away a few years and they wanted to return to it. So they had rented out their family home when they moved to Australia. They became landlords with the mindset that the tenant's rent would pay the mortgage and all the other outgoings. The narrative they heard was that debt was not a problem and mortgage debt is good debt, and having someone else pay your mortgage is the absolute goal. In 3.5 years away, the mortgage balance only dropped by about $50,000. And in hindsight, given the incomes they were on, they should have gotten after it. They should have paid it off and come back to a fully paid off home. They might have even got to collect and keep some of the rent had they done that. But it turned out that this missed opportunity was the very least of their landlording problems. He said it started out well. The property manager, an older woman who kept the 3 tenants well in order in return for their 10% cut of the rent, was replaced by a younger guy, and the whole situation, unknown to Betty and John, turned to custard. It was a phone call from a neighbour who had managed to track them down in Australia that alerted them to the fact that their house was in fact now a gang pad with 8 gang members living in it, many of them on home detention, who kept themselves busy enough by cooking and selling meth, which was in the early stages of becoming a huge issue here. They immediately rang their property manager, only to be told, nope, no problem here. That was the understatement of the century. Although they would never say never, the thought of owning a rental property ever again holds no allure. And if they did ever go down that track again, they would do things quite differently. To be honest, having heard about their experience, I can't even believe that they would consider having one again. But when they returned to Aotearoa, he returned to his old workplace. And as a nice workplace bonus, during 2020, the insurance company he worked for gave him a work bonus in the form of company shares valued at about $20,000 USD. It would take them 3 years for these stocks to vest, which means that he would gradually earn full ownership of their equity over a 3-year period. But if he left during that period, he would have to forfeit either some or all of them. Betty stayed off work for 12 months with their new baby, and then she went to work at the local hospital in a role similar to the one that she had enjoyed in Australia. Now, out of all consumer debt, with some money in savings, plus some KiwiSavers underway, they had indeed improved their financial situation, but as for a way forward, there was still no real plan. If you want to succeed financially, a tip for you all is to have a plan for the coming years and decades. When they returned to New Zealand in 2018, the housing market, meth house or not, was going mental, he said. So in 2018-2019, they sold up the home that they had purchased in 2011 for $268,000, and they sold it for $447,000. Now, although that was a $179,000 increase in price, I wouldn't be under any illusion, if I were you, that given all the grief they had with that property and the worst tenants in the world, that they pocketed that amount. There was a lot of work and expense required to make the house habitable again. They purchased another house in a nicer area for $540,000, pushing their mortgage back up to about $270,000. Now, it's at times like this that they would have reaped the benefit of having paid off their first home in full, because it meant that they would have taken on a smaller mortgage when they upsized their house. The next thing John told me was that there was a minor issue with this next house. It didn't have a bath, and they had 1 baby, soon to be 2, and they needed a bath. Crikey, I thought, here comes the expensive renovations. And he didn't disappoint. The simple act of putting a bath in resulted in them moving into the garage and a sleep out for 6 long months while they completely gutted and rebuilt the house from the inside out. They increased their mortgage to pay for the renovations, starting off with thinking that they would spend $80,000, only to end up spending $150,000, almost double. Now remember that at this time, the catch cry was that debt was cheap because interest rates were so low. Now for you listening to this, you better believe that we got deep into our kōrero, and I wondered where this story's financial wins were. Now then 2020 came around and they spent their COVID lockdowns in a garage in the midst of an incomplete renovation. But still not deterred, John said that for whatever reason, he thought it was a great idea to press on and build an additional 100 square metre shed to replace the double garage that they had just moved out of. Now, I would have thought that if a garage was good enough to live in, it was probably pretty adequate to park your car in. But his justification was that it was situated in the wrong place on their 800 square metre section and needed to be rebuilt in a better location. So in addition to the $150,000 spent on the house, they spent a further $60,000 on the new garage, so increased their lending by $210,000 up to $480,000, which is almost $500,000. Now, his justification of this additional expense was, we are not going anywhere, this is our long-term home, and with 3% interest rates, the financial outlay made sense. I remember often hearing that debt is cheap when interest rates were at their lowest point, and John and Betty, they took advantage of that. Now, my response to debt being cheap was that it was the best opportunity you would ever get to pay it off as fast as possible and pay less in interest payments. It was when he was building the new garage, for the first time, there was a kernel of doubt, and he thought, what am I doing? I can't afford to race my race car, yet I'm building a shed to put it in. And as the building work was finally coming to an end on their property, and as we moved into 2021, the mortgage interest rates started to climb and the financial pressure started to build. He said to me that at this stage, they had been back home a few years, having successfully gotten out of debt, and he was thinking, why is this not working anymore? Where does all of our money go this time? By this time, they had a before-tax household income of about $160,000 to $180,000, if you include his work bonuses, and he thought, I'm doing something wrong, but what is it? And where is the information I need to figure it out? Because this can't be right. His passion is motorsport, and all these other people are doing it and paying for it, so why can't we do it? The realization that something had to change, it started to creep up on him. In 2022, 2023, he was sitting on a ditch digger scratching away in his yard after having just had a conversation with his neighbour, where he said to John about the idea that you should save and invest 50% of your income and spend the other 50%. And John thought he should probably listen to something about money while on the digger, and that was when, he started listening to the Happy Saver podcast. And that made him aware of Scott Pape, author of The Barefoot Investor. So he listened to his audiobook, and that really clicked with him big time, he said. And then he did what many do. He went down the rabbit hole and began specifically searching for information about how to manage their household personal finances. Although an avid reader herself, Betty sat more on the sidelines of John's new hot topic, saying, I'm on the bus with you. We are 100% joint in our finances, but you do the research and give me the condensed version of what you think we should do next. I was pleased to hear that she took little convincing and was instantly on board. These two are a good team. I was interested in his take on couples joining finances, as it's something that seems quite contentious. They are 100% all in with their money. Everything is ours, not hers and mine, he said. Whatever hits their bank account, no matter who earned it, becomes theirs. The house is theirs, all the stuff inside it is theirs, and no one is keeping score either of the money made or the work, both paid and unpaid, that they do. Their view is that being married, you are meant to be a team, and that has always been their mentality. All bank accounts are joint, and they have set up the Barefoot Investor structure for Splurge, Mojo, Smile, and Fire Extinguisher, plus a few extra accounts for saving up for insurance and rates. Plus, they have one personal bank account each for some fun spending money. After listening to several episodes of The Happy Saver and re-listening to the Barefoot Investor book a second time, he started to take some steps. Now, just a quick note here too. John doesn't enjoy reading books, but it doesn't mean he is immune to learning. He just listens to books instead, So if you consider yourself a non-reader, either track down the audiobook or search in your podcast app for the author, as most end up being interviewed about their book and will give a really good summary in a shorter amount of time. Scott Pape, who's the author of The Barefoot Investor, he advocates having a date night. So these two took their laptop down to their local Thai restaurant and together they talked about what they should do. They dusted off a spreadsheet that he had actually created many years before in an effort to track their money, and they started adding to it again, starting to track their money properly for the first time in a very long time. They began to make a habit of having a regular monthly date night, and finally they stopped stumbling about with their money and they began to develop a workable plan. Hallelujah to that. They were beginning to make some progress at managing their money and things were ticking along until John became increasingly unhappy in his job and he decided to have a job change. He was growing tired of his particular sector of the insurance industry as weather events nationwide led to an increasing amount of complex claims. This need to change coincided with his 3-year period of stock ownership being up, and all the shares were now his to do with whatever he liked. They sold them for 43,000 New Zealand dollars. So what did they do with the money? They had a kind of spend half, save half mentality, he said, while admitting that they still have some work to do here, and as he gave me his figures, he was not entirely sure if they were even correct. What did he mean by this? He knew full well that probably in this season of high interest rates and having taken on more mortgage debt than they planned for, although to be clear, they didn't really even have a plan for how much they took on, given their house repair costs doubled from their guesstimate, to turn around and spend half of this money is still extravagant spending. He kept $10,000 to spend on the race car, and he admitted to feeling greedy for spending it on himself. Betty went out and bought something nice for herself too, but of much lesser value. They put $13,000 into their Mojo bank account and have since built it up to $20,000. This is their emergency fund, and it's brilliant to hear that they have created it. The rest went into their Smile and Fire Extinguisher accounts. Now, the Smile account is for long-term savings for spending on fun, so really it's just a delayed spending account, and the Fire Extinguisher is for paying debt and bills. Now, I got to admit, I was a little dismayed to hear how this windfall was deployed, but I was still happy to see little glimmers of progress in their thinking. And at this point he mentioned that they thought they might have a tax bill to pay with the IRD of about $7,000. His plan was that the money would come from the Mojo or emergency fund. Now, a few thoughts from me here as I see them trying to move in a better direction. A tax bill from the IRD is not an emergency. It is a known expense that they know is coming up, and they have a rough idea of how much it will be. They just don't know the exact amount yet. Therefore, they should be systematically setting money aside into a savings account called IRD debt or something similar, so that when the time comes, they have enough money to pay for it. They can then leave their emergency fund intact, which actually only had $13,000 in it, for a real emergency, not $20,000. The feedback I receive from people who feel they manage their money well is that if they give the bank account a name, it creates a very clear-cut purpose for that money, and it gives them a sense of security knowing that they have planned for various expenses well. If the money has a purpose, it prevents them from using it for something else entirely. But what this $43,000 from the sale of shares in 2023 did for them was give them a cash injection to at least kick off some savings accounts, which is an excellent thing. And given that it seemed to me that they were sliding back into living paycheck to paycheck, building up an emergency fund is very, very hard to do if you don't have much cash floating around after each pay cycle to do it. So this gave them a boost. John said that it is amazing how much pressure you have on your shoulders when you know you don't have a backstop of money. And he found it hard to explain, but essentially it's just a relief when you have an emergency fund. Now, having an emergency fund had been a huge behaviour change and mindset shift because previously their solution to a problem has always been, well, we can borrow if we need to. But there is a but here, one step forward, half a step back for this couple. Early in 2024, he had a job change within the insurance industry. But even though he tried to negotiate getting one, he went from having a company vehicle to having to use his own. and all of a sudden they needed $19,500 to buy a vehicle, a ute, of course. Oh no, what to do? Well, of course, they drained their accounts to buy it. They effectively used their family emergency money, plus the money they knew they owed the IRD, to buy a vehicle that will go down in value. And in a way, it's made even worse due to the fact that he puts kilometres on his vehicle and depreciates it for the good of his company. Now, at this stage of our kōrero, I was getting seriously worried about finding the positives here. I was seeing glimmers of hope, but I was still worried. Life events keep happening to them, which continually took them by surprise. They upsized their home. They spent way more than they intended to on remodelling it, and they added a bonus 100 square metre garage, all using mortgage debt in a rising interest rate market. They got a bonus $43,000 and blew half immediately, only to effectively blow the other half a few months later. This did not sound good. But enter his wife Betty, who pointed out what he said he already knew. He rushed his decision-making with the ute. And he got an "I told you so" from his darling wife. So this is music to my ears. He sold his ute for $21,500. This is a huge move. Instead of doubling down on what he realised was a mistake, he backed up and he rectified the situation. He made $2,000 on the deal, and he swore that he didn't spend any money on it during the short time he owned it. I still take his "I always made money on vehicles" with a huge grain of salt. For the next couple of months, he will be using the family car and another family member's car to get to and from work. And as if to prove his point of making money out of cars and hopefully not creating yet another one step forward, two steps back situation, he's actually purchased a written-off 9-year-old Audi for $7,000 and is now going through the process of getting it back on the road, including getting it recertified in New Zealand. Oh dear. So where did the money come from? I didn't even ask because by now I'm pretty good at guessing. The saving grace is that he is a qualified mechanic with a mint new workshop to work on the car in. But I had to tell him that, having heard this scenario many times, I have huge concerns about how much he will have to spend on this car, particularly because it's an older European car that he intends to sell. So how much does he think he can get? About $26,000, he said. And what are his plans to actually pay for his own car? Is he saving up for that now? Well, all these years later, his mentality is still to fix up a car and sell it on to finance the next one. So money doesn't really get made here. It just gets transferred from car to car, which is what he has been doing since he was a teenager. But thankfully, with his new job, money is being made in his new role as a branch manager. He has a base salary of $140,000 plus a $15,000 car allowance, which is something, I guess, plus potential annual bonuses of about $20,000. So as his journey grew ever closer to the present day, I had to know what his plan was for the future, because if they've not worked it out already, failure to plan equals plan to fail. He said they've developed a goal to be mortgage-free by 50, which is 11 years away. The year will be 2035. I needed more details here because plans need details. He jokingly told me that he wouldn't achieve it by buying and selling cars, which was a relief, but he didn't say that he would stop buying and selling cars either. He has worked out that at a 7% interest rate, they can pay off their $480,000 mortgage in 12 years. They have two loans. One has a balance of $406,000 with a 7% interest rate, and the other has $74,000 with a 6.35% interest rate. They pay $1,600 a fortnight towards their mortgage, and they are as confident as they can be that they are done with house repairs. They have been refixing their mortgage on 6-month terms, which is very short, in the hope that the interest rates will drop, but so far they have not. But when they do, they will continue to make payments at the higher rate. But then he added in 2 more words, when possible. They hope to keep payments higher than the minimum to keep knocking time off the overall term of their debt. And once the debt is smaller, and I'm not sure how much smaller, they want to move to a floating rate so that they can make as many additional payments as they can. He said that things were settling down and there was some stability to their money until they bought the ute, and having backed out of that blind alley, they have been able to reset. It has taught them a lesson, and reminded them yet again that they don't want to get into any more debt. Betty had said to John, if he learns what they need to do, then she will be all in. But what I think I see developing is that via date nights and her telling him, told you so, in regards to that ute, she is becoming less of an interested bystander and more of an active participant. And he said himself, they are much more of a team now as they slowly develop a plan for the months and the years ahead. When it came to their mortgage, a previous colleague, who was also an ex-banker, helped them think through the mortgage they were taking on and was always happy to have a conversation about money if asked, and it's great to have someone like that in your corner. He advised John to plan as if the mortgage rate was double what it currently is and see how your finances would hold up at that rate. He is thankful that they did that because that is the scenario that they find themselves in now, and they are trying to make it work. And as he spoke, I could see that they were pulling back from the brink of some grim financial situations. For example, if he had have kept that ute, having used all of their emergency and tax savings to buy it, then what exactly would they have done when the IRD sent them the bill, which they absolutely will be doing soon? Or what if the heat pump blew up, or the repairs on the Audi cost $5,000 instead of $3,000? I have absolutely no doubt that they would have forced themselves back into debt, probably by extending their mortgage if the bank would allow them to, and that they would have felt that they had zero choice in the matter. But honestly, they had every choice in the matter. You simply have to develop a short, medium, and long-term mindset when it comes to money and be managing your money in such a way that you can cope with all scenarios. Of course, another way to solve a potential money problem is for John or Betty or both of them to head back to Australia as a fly-in, fly-out worker and earn a much higher income. And I asked if that was on the cards for them. And he said that the two of them have had many conversations about this possibility. Before his recent job change, he was all over the place for 6 to 12 months, weighing up work options, and returning to Australia to work came up many times. But now, with the young whānau, for many valid reasons, it's just not an option. That door has closed. And that is a really important point to take away from this. The status quo of today won't remain that way for long. I too once actually worked in the mines in Australia, and I made enough money in 2 years to pay for 5 years of tertiary education. But I worked incredibly hard shift work for my money. It was the right thing to do at the time, and I was young, and I saw barely sleeping for days on end as quite the adventure. But in subsequent years, when I've thought about going back to doing that, it's just no longer an option. I just don't want to do that again because life has moved on. Which is why, wherever you are at in life, you have to treat the income that you are making with the respect it deserves, because if you manage every dollar well today, you are far less likely to make financial mistakes that see you having to go back to earn the big bucks in an environment that felt fine when you were in your 20s, but feels terrible when you are in your 30s and 40s with a young family. Again, that is why when he sold his shares for $43,000, he could have used that money to continue to stabilise the financial situation of the whole family, not treat it as some kind of windfall. If he is anything like me, the more I learn about our family finances, the more I regret past decisions I've made when I had a lump sum of money and a decision to make. The goal is to make more right decisions as you age. Now, as I near the end, it's yet another long episode, I just wanted to take a snapshot of where the money sits today. I realised that although we spoke for 2 most excellent hours, there were just so many questions I didn't quite get to. Thank goodness for KiwiSaver, but more so, thank goodness for Australian superannuation and its higher contribution rates, which have given their funds a really good bump. Money invested earlier in life has longer to compound and grow, and both John and Betty are going to be happy campers when they turn 65 because I predict they will have some good balances that they can use in their retirement years. Although hearing John's passion for motorsport, it does worry me that he'll do what I've heard a few retirees do now, just drain the KiwiSaver account to buy a classic car. So Betty, please keep an eye on him, okay? John has his KiwiSaver with simplicity and a growth fund with a current balance now of $118,000. Betty is with ANZ, also in a growth fund, with a balance of $81,000, so making a combined KiwiSaver balance of almost $200,000, which is fantastic. Because they are both so far out from retirement, they have made a good choice to be in growth funds. The reason KiwiSaver is such a good investment vehicle is that it moves the money off to one side, out of harm's way, and as long as they both continue to contribute a portion of every paycheck to their accounts, they will have an excellent nest egg to supplement their superannuation savings. Now, I use the sorted KiwiSaver calculator to do some back-of-the-napkin math, and I think they could be reasonably confident that their combined balance will be up around the $800,000 mark at 65. And that supposes that neither of them get a pay rise or work more hours. So they are doing really well with their retirement savings. When I talk about thinking long term in regards to KiwiSaver, they really need to be thinking about their financial balance and also keeping an eye on government superannuation rates over the next 2 decades. The higher the balance, the easier it will be to cope with any curveballs the government might toss their way, such as changing the retirement age or means testing super. In 2023, they also started to invest $50 a week using Sharesies with a current balance of $1,500 and have money spread across 3 SmartShares ETFs, the Australian 200, the US 500 and the New Zealand 50. Working out how and where to invest outside of KiwiSaver is a good idea, particularly if you intend to retire before 65. But I think for now, their money is working hard enough for them, bringing their emergency fund balance up, cash flowing life, paying off a mortgage, and saving for retirement. Throughout this episode, we keep mentioning cars, and currently, in addition to Betty's car and the Audi Do-Up, he has 2 other hobby cars that have a combined value of about $60,000. After the extensive renovations to their home, he thinks their house now has a value of about $850,000, hopefully more, meaning that if you take the equity of $370,000 into account, plus their $199,000 in KiwiSaver, they have a net worth of about $569,000, which at the ages of 38 and 39 is absolutely moving in the right direction. He gets to decide whether he adds the value of the cars into his net worth, but I'd be hesitant to. All it takes is for him to write one off to have its value go to zero, although you would hope, given his line of work, that it is well insured. But if he were to sell them, $60,000 could go a long way in reducing their mortgage, and that's a question worth considering, don't you think? They also want to be in a position to help their kids learn about money and also financially help them out in the years ahead, if required. We ran out of time to go into this, but I explained that over on my blog, thehappysaver.com, I write about how I'm educating my daughter about how to become financially independent, so there are some really good resources you can check out there. Currently, with their money locked into KiwiSaver until 65 and the equity locked into their home, with a significant mortgage still to pay, they are not in a position to help anyone out. They have the classic Kiwi conundrum, an inaccessible net worth with money tied up in assets they can't touch, plus a hefty dose of debt. But I have high hopes for the future with them making better financial decisions and fewer mistakes. With his new salary of $140,000 a year, plus Betty earning $65,000 a year in her planning and development role she now has, with a bit more planning, they have the use of a $205,000 income plus bonuses to be able to build a stronger financial base. Currently, to use Dave Ramsey's words, they earn too much money to feel this broke. I've put words in John's mouth there. He never told me he feels broke, but things do feel a little precarious at times, and given their incomes, they really shouldn't. The key, in my unasked for opinion, is to get some basics locked in now. An emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of monthly expenses, which include their mortgage payment. Saving up and paying cash for short to medium term expenses, such as cars and holidays. Saying no more to taking on any more debt. Paying into retirement funds, which they are currently doing beautifully. And either downsizing their house, which is not going to happen, or making extra payments to get their mortgage paid off faster than their 12-year goal. In time, they may have enough income left over to begin to build up those share market ETFs too, but for now, they wouldn't be my priority. Stopping them from sliding back into debt would be my priority, and that can only happen if you have some good goal planning sessions. In these sessions, you map out a mortgage payoff journey and what you are likely to want to spend money on, and I'm particularly thinking about cars here. I'd like to see them create a concrete debt payoff tracker or spreadsheet where they track their net worth, they budget their income, their mortgage payments, and decreasing mortgage balance. They need to be able to see what a change in interest rate, either up or down, will do to their end date, and what extra payments made will also do to that date. And failing to track it means they don't really have a fixed payoff date of 2036. It's more just a guess. With an income of $205,000, they have a ton of options, and all of them are good. I had to ask John, knowing what he knows now, what he wants to say to people listening to this. Well, his answer is very insightful. Firstly, it was to automate as much as you can with your money, and I agree with that. Secondly, the biggest thing he has learned in the last 12 months is that after you have started to acquire some new financial information that teaches some good financial skills, you should just start doing it. He said that getting into the habit of being good with money is so much easier than getting out of a bad habit. He's spot on here. If you just start doing the right thing, then each time you move to do the wrong thing, your logical brain or your wife will pull you back into line. And with each passing week, month, and year, you will build upon your new good habits, and you'll just let the old ones go. One new habit is that he had thought about investing in ETFs for a few years, and he never did anything. But they finally just started investing $50 a week and then automated the transaction. Before they knew it, they had $1,500 and were climbing. Now, one concern with this, though, is that without having their sinking fund bank accounts or their general savings accounts or emergency fund all set up, they run the risk of needing money urgently at some point and then selling those investments. I don't want to see them do this, and they need to keep in mind that you don't invest money in the share market that you need in the short term, and the short term is anything less than 5 years. He said that they are both getting better at moving towards a better decision and having the wisdom to tell the difference between a good long-term decision and a poor short-term one. And his biggest financial triumph is, with each passing week, continuing to change his mentality around money. He is moving away from asking himself, how can I have what I want now, and more into how can I get out of this current situation and improve our lives. His second triumph is using their Australian superannuation to pump up their Kiwi savers. And as to their greatest financial flop, he said it was not making the most of the 2.3% mortgage interest rate they once had. They went, wow, debt is cheap, let's borrow more, instead of, wow, that's cheap, let's get out of debt as fast as we can. Now they have to do it the hard way, he said. Yep, they sure do. Now, as for tools and resources that he has been using to help him learn, more recently he's been listening to Dave Ramsey and is following up on his 7 baby steps. And he said that he prefers to find something he likes and he listens to heaps of it. And given the Ramsey Network puts out a few episodes every day, there is plenty to keep him occupied there. Plus, I like how they just continue to stick to the basics of money, which are, he says, put $1,000 in a beginner emergency fund, pay off all debt using the debt snowball, put 3 to 6 months of expenses into savings as a full emergency fund, invest 15% of your household income for retirement, begin college funding for your kids, pay off your home early, and then build wealth and give generously. So they've already completed steps 1 and 2. They are working on step 3 and 4. They may or may not save for their children's education, and they have it in their mind to pay off their home early. And I think that when they get there, they are going to love step 7, especially because that is when he can and will have the means to tinker on all the cars he likes. Now, the Donegans from Rebel Finance School on YouTube, they talk about increasing the gap between what you earn and what you spend, and then using that surplus money to pay down debt and invest in assets that put money in your pocket. And if these two can really focus on that, given their high income, they will make swift progress. Now, the Donegans' free 10-week online course is well worth checking out, and I think would fill in a lot of the gaps missing in their knowledge. John's advice is to find the information that speaks to you and engage with it. And because he specifically mentioned Dave Ramsey, I suggested he reads his book, and you might like it too, which is called The Total Money Makeover, or there's another one called Everyday Millionaires by Chris Hogan too. Now, that was a really long episode, but before I wrap up, I have another quick message from today's sponsor. If your finances are holding you back from living the life you want, try Pocketsmith out. They've got the tools to help you make money management easier. And have we got a deal for you? Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. That's pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. Now, being financially sorted means different things to different people. Although I wish he had picked a cheaper hobby, I really want John to have the financial means to indulge his passion for cars, but I never want it to be at the jeopardy of his family's wealth. His financial awakening is happening incrementally, and based on the tone of his original email to me, I think they are getting better at making a distinction between a financial decision that will set them up for later success, which is paying off their mortgage faster, and one that will set them back, which is spending their emergency fund and some on a ute. They are coming around to the concept of buying assets and not liabilities. The more they feel out the repercussions of each decision, he told me that soon after buying the ute he realised it was the wrong decision, the more they will be able to spot a good financial decision over a poor one. It's like he has to touch the burning stove to know if it's hot. Being told just isn't enough. And he credited this podcast as one of the first things that motivated him enough to do something, and they are definitely a work in progress. But by sharing the journey of John and Betty, I hope you might recognise yourself in their journey. You might be about to justify a house extension, a new boat for summer, or spending a windfall on cars or holidays when you can put it towards building up an emergency fund or paying off your house. And you might be able to pull yourself back from the brink of a decision that might feel good in the moment, but will delay your financial progress over time. Now, I get that we all want nice things, but we've all been told that we can have anything we want right when we want it, when in reality, sometimes we've got to be an adult and wait. And if you can learn patience and can stop making knee-jerk financial decisions, then you will, without a doubt, end up better off. I loved when he said that getting into the habit of being good with money is so much easier than getting out of a bad habit. And that's my takeaway from this episode. To get better at spotting and implementing good financial habits, leaving less room for the poor ones. So just to end, I just wanted to thank John for chatting with me at length, particularly when I challenged him quite a bit along the way. Thank you to Betty for letting him speak on your behalf. You two are a great team that is becoming more financially aligned with each passing month. So just keep it up. So that's all from me this week. If you want to get in touch, you know you can find me at thehappysaver.com. And thanks also to all the people who send me such lovely emails telling me that you like this podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And please do share it with your friends. It is the best way that people can learn about the podcast. And I would love it most if you would talk more about money with your own friends and whānau and help me continue to help others be better with money. So until next time, happy saving.